All right. Thank you, Dr. Remster. Please take it away.
Hi, good afternoon to most of you, or good morning. Thank you so much for coming. Very excited to be here today. And yeah. All right, let's do it. I could talk about these things all day long. So please, you know, I'm really eager. I've left time for questions. I'm really, you know, whatever is on your mind. If it's related, I'm happy to talk about it. So please keep that in mind as you're listening. And yeah, okay, here we go. Slideshow. Is that correct?
Looks great. Thank you.
Technology is not my forte, but anyway. It is such a pleasure to be working with Redistricting Data Hub on this. And so thank you so much for having us here today. My name is Brianna Remster. I'm a social scientist. I study the consequences of mass criminalization and incarceration, and I'm an associate professor at Villanova. My very talented co-author, Rory Creamer, he will be conducting the part 2 session on Tuesday that Kate already mentioned. We actually have opposite teaching schedules this semester, so he's not with us today. And I won't be with you on Tuesday, but we're trading off. And Dr. Creamer is a race and residential segregation scholar, and also an associate professor at Villanova. So yeah, is more technical. He's the data wizard. So please, you know, if you really want to get into the nuts and bolts, please come on Tuesday. All right. Okay. So very briefly, I'm going to first lay out, remind us, refresh us what the heck prison gerrymandering is. I'm going to tell you a little bit about how Rory and I have been studying it and why it matters. And then a little bit about our ongoing project and what that means for you folks. And then some of the ways that states are addressing this issue, right? Because we're at a really exciting time in that so many states just in the past, well, 3/4 of states that have changed their policy in recent years did so within the last 3 years, right? And so there's a lot of momentum, and I'm just so pleased to see so many people signed up and here for today to learn more about it. So, all right. In principle, I know we all know this, but everybody is guaranteed equal representation, right? And that includes non-voters, every person in the population, right? When we draw political districts. So that means children, non-citizens, and people incarcerated in the United States and most states cannot vote, right? But they're counted for representation purposes because you don't have to be an eligible voter to contact your legislator or use the services that your legislator's office provides. But as you know, the Census Bureau currently counts incarcerated people where they're confined instead of their home districts. And importantly, this is an administrative policy that dates back over 200 some years, long before mass incarceration ever happened. And for most of US history, it had little impact on our representation. And so to be extra clear, this policy was put together by census employees for a way to make sure that everyone was counted, and it was never about like extra legal punishment, in contrast to voting, which is a very standard American extra legal punishment, right? So this was just a policy that at this point is very outdated, and it turns out causing a lot of issues with our democracy today, right? So this practice, counting incarcerated people where they're held instead of their home communities, politically advantages districts that have prisons, right? And here's our reminder. So I know you folks are largely redistricting, voting is your wheelhouse. So if, yeah, use our little mini crash course in crime and incarceration. And I show you this to remind us that for that this period of globally high record incarceration rates, right, that the U.S. leads the globe in, it has not always been this way, and it doesn't, everything is a policy. What I tell my students is everything is a policy decision, right? But we existed for long before, this dramatic growth, the reason why, here's a better way to put it, the reason why we didn't hear about prison gerrymandering much until recent years, despite the fact that it's always been there, it just hasn't been big enough to like concern us about constitutional ideas of equal representation. It's not going away anytime soon, right? It came out of and so in terms of, because sometimes people say things like, oh, but I heard that like we're doing reforms and mass incarceration is ending, so I don't really need to fix it in my community, right? It's going to happen organically. Unfortunately, we would have to dial back things so much that there's no proposal that would anywhere that's being in popular public discourse that would change where we're at right now enough to roll back, right? Okay. The other thing I want to note here really quickly is that we are, at least for today, talking largely about people who are incarcerated in state facilities, right? And it's a data availability issue that we'll get to, and Rory will talk more about next week. But just to to frame it and to give us a little bit of a foundation, the vast majority of people who are incarcerated in the United States, 1.7 million right now, 1.7 million are in state facilities, right? Because they've broken a state law, versus local facilities are jails, right? And that's where people are held largely pre-trial. Right? And then the federal system, in contrast, is tiny, right, of folks who have violated federal law. And so, yeah, it's very much within states' purview and realm to think about how they, count their own folks and so on. Great. So the reason why, so we've got 1.7 million, by the way, in state, and well over 2 million total collectively, right? And we've got, if prison gerrymandering was, well, the practice of counting people where they were incarcerated, it wouldn't necessarily matter, except for that we live in a highly racially residentially segregated society, right? So we've got so incarcerated people are the only folks who are moved across district boundaries, forced, right? Not by choice, and because of where people are originating from and the districts that they're going to, we end up getting really big really big changes. And so what we're looking at here at the moment is, this is called the racial dot map project, and it can be really useful for just getting a very bird's eye glimpse at what's going on. This is zoomed all the way in to look at a district in Northwest Pennsylvania, House District 8. And what we can see here is that all of the, so this is a pretty rural district. All of the white residents in District 8 are, you can see like in the, toward the upper left quadrant, right, is where people live, because 1 dot equals 1 person. And in sharp contrast, we've got down toward right in the center, bottom center, that green blob, that's State Correctional Institute Mercer. Right. And so when we are to look at like this district's racial demographics and composition, in reality, the people of color, for the most part in that district, are in SCI Mercer, right? And so, yeah, we can see how far away white residents live from the prison. We can see that folks who are incarcerated are, you can see it spatially, but also, you know, think about how they're not part of the community in District 8 in any meaningful way. Right? And so we've also got, we've got people being moved from largely urban areas, right, out of their community to communities that are really different than them. Right. And so, you know, aside from like the physical lockdown razor wire facilities, you know, there's not many commonalities between folks because of, you know, having such different concerns. Right. So many states look like PA around the country. Right. And while I just showed you a very rural area, just to give you one other quick view, this is a suburban district in northeast of Philadelphia. And what you can see here, District 150 in Pennsylvania actually has the most people incarcerated, comprising its population, and that's because it has a state prison, SCI Phoenix, which is up in the upper top, and then Montgomery County Jail is down near the bottom. And so you can see this is a pretty dense population area as compared to where we were just looking. And yet, again, we see that people of color are concentrated inside those two facilities and everybody else is spread out. Right? Okay. So this is what ends up happening, basically, is that people who have a prison in their district, which, by the way, no matter where you live or how high your state's incarceration rate is, most people do not benefit from this practice. And that's because while we have this extraordinary, in both time and place and whatnot, levels of mass incarceration, there's still a very small minority of districts have a prison in them. And so, but if you have a prison in your district, then likely your vote is, well, your voice is a little, is louder. Right. And what happens is, and we've had a lot of attention on, and it's so important how largely rural and suburban communities are benefiting from having a prison. Again, a minority of suburban and rural communities. But the other half of the problem that Rory and I, it particularly drew us to want to investigate how much this mattered, was that they're not just like, incarcerated folks aren't just there inflating the vote of people who live near a prison. They're also missing from their home communities, right? So they're not just benefiting a district that has a prison, they're punishing this policy is affecting everyone who lives in that home district, right? And so we really wanted to know how much, how much of an impact is this when districts are missing very consistent, stable, so because incarceration is so concentrated spatially, and it tends to remain pretty stable over time in terms of, we don't see dramatic fluctuations in neighborhoods or whatnot. The very hyper policing and surveillance of Black and Brown communities means, in part that we are going to, these things don't change dramatically, right? And so, what is happening to people's representation who live in these communities who have never been stopped for speeding, right? And again, I said it's not part of punishment, but I think it's really important to understand the community level impact that we're talking about here, right? It's not just where the individual who's incarcerated is counted as affecting them. It is so much bigger than that. So why does this all really matter? Like where you're counted and whatnot? It's because it's that much harder to get your concerns heard by your legislator, right? When you live in a district that is like District B, and you've got, and where we really see, and this is so important, I promise I'll continue to splice in as much as possible, but what happens with prison gerrymandering is very unequal workloads among legislators. And I say that because those are the folks who we've heard so many interesting stories from as we've been talking to folks about our work in terms of people are very aware of how much. So for instance, representatives that are serving a district who have a higher incarceration rate, they're doing like double duty, right? And that's because they always, and they feel very strongly that they take the calls that come from prisons, right? Even though they do not technically represent those folks. Right? They feel very strongly obligated to, and there can often be very serious issues that they treat those folks like because they were from their community, right? And so they're doing a lot more work than someone who happens to represent a district like District A, who has far fewer people calling them, right? Because a decent chunk of their district is incarcerated. Right? And we know from looking at polls, there's a legislative poll, a poll of Kentucky legislators a few years back that asked whether they considered their people who are incarcerated in their district as constituents. And they overwhelmingly said no, right? This is not a population that is considered to be constituents. Right? And so it's easier to get your voice heard if you're in a district that happens to have a prison, right? Versus if you live further away from a prison, then it's much harder for you to get your voices heard. Okay? So the good news is, as we mentioned, many states are beginning to address this. Many states are considering addressing this, and it's really not difficult to do. I want to emphasize that. Today a lot. We're not talking about super fancy statistics or things. I know it's a pretty intuitive process, I hope, and again, talk through questions, but we make population adjustments, whoever's doing redistricting does, for a reason, right? With every census, long before people ever brought up prison gerrymandering. Right? And so this is part of the redistricting process, right? And we're toward the tail end of the current one right now. So I have to give a shout out to the Prison Policy Initiative, right? And because I don't think any of us would be here today if it was not for their extraordinary work. If you're not familiar with it, I highly recommend it. Peter Wagner, who began that organization over 20 years ago, made prison gerrymandering his cause, and we're now like reaping the fruits of his and his team's extraordinary dedication over in recent decades. And so those of you who are familiar with their work know that they're a fantastic, public policy organization promoting lots of awareness with great graphics and accessible, explanations of what the heck this is. And what they in part do, and they've since expanded into all different other areas of thinking about mass incarceration and how it affects our society at large, is they often, have removed. So there's two parts, right? There's the part of people who are inflating the district where they're incarcerated, right? And so right now, that's a little bit easier to quickly check, right? How many, because of the way the census, because they're in group quarters, right? Removing them. And so Rory and I, as someone thinking about mass incarceration and Rory thinking about race, we really wanted to figure out but what about the people that are missing and how much does it matter, right? Like we have, as you know, many pressing issues to deal with these days. And so, trying to bring social science to the table and say, how much of a problem is this? That's where we came in and are building on the Prison Policy Initiative's foundational work, right? So this was, as Kate mentioned at the beginning, years ago, we analyzed Pennsylvania, and I should note, while we are in Pennsylvania, we didn't, it was helpful to start there, but we actually chose Pennsylvania, A, based on data availability, but B, it's a pretty middle of the road state in terms of our demographic characteristics, our geography and urbanization patterns, as well as our incarceration rate, right? So already from the get-go, we were we didn't want to go with an extreme outlier. We wanted to go with one that, that there are many states that are similar, right? And what we found was, so what we did was sorry, I got very excited. We removed people from the districts where they're incarcerated, and we used our estimation method to return them to their home districts, right? And I want to be extra clear here. So there are a variety of ways to what we call reallocate people, right? And this, the more precise data that we have, and what do we mean by precise data? People's home address. Right? Addresses are the magical unicorn that we're after here to be able to do it in the ideal situation, right? But often we don't have addresses, right? And so Rory and I came up with a model to say, okay, how can we return people based on the county that committed them, right? So that's where they committed their crime, and were sentenced and then sent somewhere all over Pennsylvania, far, far away. So by county and by racial demographics was how we return people. So these are estimates. And what we've seen is that the more precise information that we get, the more, the closer we get to having an actual geocodable address like everyone else in the census has, the stronger the results get. So I really want to emphasize that this is very, this is a conservative set of estimates, right? And we found that, so Pennsylvania our maps are not, and for most places, they're not actually in effect. They might have been passed, but they're for our brand new 2020 maps, but they're not in place yet. And so as of right now, if we removed incarcerated people from the districts where they're incarcerated and reallocated them by the county that they came from and matching racial demographics, we've got some problems with representation in Pennsylvania. Right. And those of you we have a wide range of backgrounds in here, but district size requirements are generally plus or minus 5% deviation. And that's a Texas court ruling that has withstood many challenges over the years. Most states use that cutoff. And so all we do is take the total population of the state, divide it by the number of districts that we have, and that's where we get, and then you can be plus or minus 5%. Right? Otherwise, we have grounds for court cases and whatnot that were conflicting with what equal representation means under current Supreme Court, right? And so 4 districts would be too big and 4 districts would be too small, 8 total districts. Those 4 districts that are too large, meaning that we need to adjust the boundaries so that everybody is getting equal representation, have over 264,000 people in them. So again, there are roughly 40,000 people incarcerated in Pennsylvania state facilities, right, who are counted somewhere else. But we're talking about community level impacts that are far larger, right, than simply the incarcerated population. And so if we ended prison gerrymandering today in Pennsylvania under these maps, we would have to make adjustments, right? And so that's what Rory and I were initially after, was trying to see, like, does it matter anywhere near legal thresholds? Yes. It also has a very unequal, not surprisingly, I think, given that incarceration is disproportionately concentrated among Black and Brown residents relative to white residents, that it was really because of our residential segregation and our unequal policing practices, where it was really advantaging Pennsylvania white residents were benefiting, right? And versus it was diminishing, weakening Black and Brown residents representation, and this is under the current maps. Why does all this matter? Because it really pushed change. And I'm very, very proud of that. I think this might be a career highlight. We don't get to see a lot of data-driven policy in the social sciences. And so it was very exciting to be part of. And I highlight it because Pennsylvania is like many states in terms of the circumstances of ending prison gerrymandering. So this is a bit of a like fairy tale where we have, it doesn't need to be a fairy tale, but it felt like it at the time, where we have, you know, Rory and I having done research and published that article in a peer-reviewed journal, and, you know, time went by and we gave some talks and whatnot, but it wasn't until we started really connecting with community groups and meeting folks who, you know, were concerned about this, that really started to take off, right? And so because it is a very intuitive, basic idea that if some people don't have equal representation, like, what does that mean for the rest of us, right? It had really broad bipartisan appeal for various reasons. But so Pennsylvania is, again, like many states where it's a Republican-controlled legislature. I love James Carville's quote many years ago that Pennsylvania is like Philadelphia, excuse me, and Pittsburgh with Alabama in between, right? And so a handful of years ago, Representative McClinton is a Philadelphia area representative. She introduced legislation to end how we count incarcerated people in Pennsylvania. Not surprisingly, it didn't move forward in the legislature, and what it did was raise awareness, right? And so legislative changes are, by and large, as of the moment, the most common way that states have made changes, right? But there are other ways. So the courts would be the second mechanism, right? And the third is during redistricting. So the NAACP Legal Defense Fund had filed a lawsuit citing Rory's and my findings, and that was beginning to move forward, but then things changed, right? So the Pennsylvania, the Redistricting Commission, the LRC decided to, after listening to our testimony and replicating our findings and whatnot with their own state geographer, they voted in August, this past August, to change how they count a portion of state folks, right? And what is critical to this process was, and it was honestly one of the most extraordinary things I've ever seen, it filled me with so much hope. This, during like the beginning of the pandemic, when so many of us were just, all of us, hard pressed, hard times for, and still are for so many reasons, but people came together in ways that were just so inspiring. Like there over 150 some organizations became part of this coalition. They wrote letters, they had Zoom forums they had, and it was really people telling their personal stories, having people get on and share, what it felt like to have their body counted to advantage, like Salim here, whose quote is on the slide, that the power of that kind of narrative simply cannot be overstated. I'm happy to quantify and use my methods and data to tell you like the magnitude of an effect, but it was truly multiple factors coming together. Right, that some lovely looking figures from the researchers and raising and elevating the voices of returning folks, returning citizens, as well as their family members, their community members, et cetera, and having policymakers, activists and organizers, impacted folks, and researchers in the same room is what really pushed this over the edge, in my opinion. Right? And so I say this because Pennsylvania was the first state to do so via its redistricting commission. And now Rhode Island has followed suit just recently in the last couple of weeks. And they were signed into law, and Montana is about to any moment. And so this is really kind of an under known mechanism until now that it doesn't have to go through the legislature. It doesn't have to go through years of court battles. I mean, all of them are great routes, but there's ways to address it that are legally, constitutionally, and so on, compliant and get this fixed. Okay, so here's our little timeline that I mentioned a moment ago, where most of the change that has been happening has just been in the last couple of years. And again, that's due to President Policy Initiative. And you can see that only until recently, right, it wasn't done via redistricting commissions, but yeah, it's been going on for a while, right? Currently, so I'm not sure where to count Montana because they've they're reallocating incarcerated people, but they have not technically signed it into law yet. So it's they're one of the later rounds of mapping. But I'm going to keep going because so many things to talk about. As I mentioned, so Roy and I did Pennsylvania using the previous census maps, and then all of a sudden there was this outpouring of interest in our research, right? Because at the beginning when we started doing this kind of work, people were like, well, but what about felon disenfranchisement, right? Like, I don't know what prison gerrymandering is, but, and now 5-7 years later, prison gerrymandering now is increasingly, thanks to, I'm sure, many of your efforts, is really increasing in awareness. And so there was this exciting surge in interest in our research, and we realized that we had to know what was happening in 2020, right? So with our new or about to be new maps. And so we decided to extend beyond Pennsylvania and do as many states as we can get, and be able to see both the impact in the states that are continuing to count incarcerated people where they're confined inside their home communities, and also to look at the states who changed it and see like how much, what did they do? Were they able to really mitigate and reduce this? So we're right in the thick of it right now. And I have to shout out very briefly our lead researcher on our research team, Denise Wilson. I think she's with us this afternoon, and none of this, her ability to amass data is just will never cease to wow me. And we're lucky to have some students and a little funding helping us do this kind of wild project that we took on, but we're really, really enjoying. And that's what brought us together with Redistricting Hub. So this is my little sneak preview of our results coming. So we decided we wanted to start with a state this time around that, by all accounts, given its very high rate of incarceration and its demographics and whatnot, if it's going to be anywhere, we thought Texas might be a good bet, right? And so Texas has, in the maps that were fast-tracked through in record time, that are, they don't go into effect until next January, but they're all set to go. We're talking about at least 15% of districts would be unconstitutional if we counted incarcerated people differently, right? For the next 10 some years, right? And so 12 would be too small, and they range from districts losing 400 some people when we remove and return, all the way up to the most egregious district lost 13,000 people. There's a lot of prisons in Texas. Yeah, learning more about my own geography of the US than probably since grade school. But 11 districts, on the other hand, would be too large. Right? And those were districts that gained a lot of people. And so while many, we've been really lucky in part, thanks to Denise's work, to get addresses, because then we can return people and have, at least so far in our experience, find much bigger effects. We did not have addresses for Texas. Right. So we can't geocode them like we do with the rest of our census process. So we use the exact same method that we did in our published work in Pennsylvania. Right. And so this is really just, again, kind of like a bare minimum situation for, if anything, the impact is likely greater than what we're showing you at the moment. And when we look by race, this is just showing us that it does not impact the average Texas resident equally. Instead, and this is just state average, right? To look at how it really shows a striking impact that the average white Texan, right? If we ended prison gerrymandering today, they would lose about 165 people from their district, right? On average across the state. The average Black Texan would gain about 128 new folks in their district, right? Because it's Texas, of course, the Latinx population is far larger. Latinx folks in Texas would gain about 164 new people in their district. And not new people, but you know what I mean, like as in our population adjustments. Right? And people who identified as other racial identities would also gain a lot, about 184. And so this was the, when we did this for Pennsylvania, this was what really seemed to be the most important to the Redistricting Commission when the idea that we don't all have equal say is pretty powerful. Right? And very, very concentrated, right? So what this is meaning is that we're devaluing. So in Texas, for the next 10 some years, whites have more political influence and power and voices and access to their representative than people of color, right? And it's at people of color's expense. So we could do a whole presentation on state reallocations. And while there's certainly lots of consistencies or similarities across states, there's not, no one has done it identically, right? And so we've been learning from places like California and New York and Delaware that did it in the last cycle, right? Which, by the way, have, I'm sorry, Maryland, not Delaware, have withstood court challenges, multiple court challenges, right, over the years. But if we were, just for the sake of time, to recommend, if you're, and again, this is something I'm happy to talk more about, but if we were to recommend a state that, at least at this point, right, not having completed our analyses of how good things ended up in California, their overall, the technical decisions that they made to reallocate people seem to be the most fair toward achieving equal representation. What the heck did they do? So first of all, they specifically legislated, or it doesn't matter whether it's legislative or just in the policy where you change how you count people, they said, here's exactly how we're going to do it. Right? So a handful of states, and again, early days, we all live and learn, right? Just passed legislation saying we're going to change how we count people. And then it was up to people on the ground, like, to figure out, what does that mean? How are we going to do this? Who do we include here or there? And I think that unintentionally resulted in some less than ideal strategies, right? Because it wasn't thought out ahead of time. Now we have lots of models and experience to look to. But so California specified, here's how we're going to do it. They reallocated everyone. In contrast to, some states have changed based on sentence length, right? Like people who are incarcerated for life shouldn't be reallocated back. While I think there is an intuitive idea there of, well, this person's never coming out, why should they be counted elsewhere? If life means life in your state, it does in Pennsylvania, as in there's no chance of parole. But the point is that because the reason why, if we're really trying to mitigate racial inequality in representation, if we're really trying to move closer toward achieving equal representation and what it was meant to be, there's that community level impact. Because if the person who is incarcerated for life, if they are somehow magically released tomorrow, in all likelihood, given the concentration and stability of incarceration, their prison bed is going to be, their bunk is going to be replaced with somebody down the block. Right. And so it's about, yes, people cycle in and out. There's a lot of that with our system and the number of people incarcerated, but where people come from is stable, right? And so it's the rest of that district that is really important, to think about those large scale community effects, right? And because of our residential segregation and income inequality, people don't necessarily choose where they live, right? Okay, so lots of great resources detailing like how states did this. Erica Wood's piece is one of them, but there's many more. And I really hope that you will stay tuned for our findings. So what our partnership with RDH means is that as we continue completing our analyses for this 50-state project, the Redistricting Hub Data Hub has agreed to post our findings and as well as our data sets. And that's coming up. I'll come back to that in a moment. But and so you'll be able to look up your own state. Hopefully only a couple of states so far have we like hit total dead ends and not being able to get any data. But we're still, I've still been given up hope. But so those reports, those sort of, you know, mini highlight reels that are just going to be like heavily on, you know, the infographic side. As soon as we, I hope the first one will get published, will get posted at the end of next week. Still working on getting a few logistics figured out, but please keep checking back and stay tuned because as we complete them, they'll be posted. And we're also sharing our data. So if you are into data and want to look at things yourself, you can download our files and play around on your own, right? So let's see. Last thing I wanted to mention about California that makes it different than all of the other states, I believe, is that if there are missing addresses, and this is a huge problem because right now it's not a big problem. But it's a concern that people talk about a lot. But as far as like a limitation or data problem, I can tell you that it's not that big. But what should we do with people who don't have an address, right? Because right now states are largely that have made the change are trying to, and Pennsylvania is one of them, where we haven't collected the data that is ideal to do this, right? Instead, we're leveraging what we have. And that is, you know, it is far better to return someone with Department of Corrections address that, you know, wasn't collected in census format, isn't, you know, quite as, census folks start to get a little bit nervous because they're like, are you kidding me? Because we all work with really different types of data versus as the person who works with a lot of criminal justice administrative data, I'm like, this is great. But what happens if we don't have an address, if an address is, we can't verify it, right? If it doesn't exist, if there's typos, things like that, you know, that's where states have struggled to figure out, and many states have kept people incarcerated, kept them counted in the district where they're incarcerated if they can't find a usable address, right? And again, going forward, as we move toward better data collection and getting precise addresses, this will no longer be an issue. But I really admire California's foresight in, well, what should we do with those people? And their thinking was, why would we continue to let some people, you know, basically it's still allowing prison gerrymandering to have an effect if we allow some people, if we keep some people, right, in the district population counts where they're incarcerated. That means it's still advantaging the people who happen to live near a prison, right? And so what they did was they're like, anybody who has a missing address, we're going to randomize where they go in districts across California. Right? So every district benefited equally from any missing addresses. Right? And finally, they also had a clause in there that was something along the lines of, if we don't get the data that we need to be able to reallocate people, we're just going to randomize them, right? And I think that was very good foresight on there, because they're, you know, the bureaucracy, the time, the challenges of getting, there were many little hiccups in the road, and I think having that carrot with the stick was a smart strategy for, well, this is what's going to happen if we can't get the data, right? Sort of situation. And just to close, because I really want to get to, I see many comments in the chat. This is sort of my myth busting slide or two, because there's a lot of misinformation, and Peter Wagner and his colleagues at the Prison Policy Initiative might sort of die on this hill, but I would be remiss if I did not know, and I I hate doing it because people are always very disappointed, but this is not a funding, this is not changing how you count incarcerated people is not going to impact funding formulas. And I say that I don't like saying that because people get really excited about what it could mean for reallocating resources. I put the Prison Policy Initiatives, one of their great articles title, if you want to dig into that, but basically the funding for formulas are too specific. And they also require that we use federal funding formulas and I'm sorry, the federal census unadjusted counts, right? So nothing is really based on total population, like moving incarcerated people into different districts is, right? And, you know, when there have been some rare exceptions, those are something that clearly needs to be solved. Right. If a local district is paying more because the state prison is using their roads or something like that. But nothing that is systematic or large scale. And I think it's so important to understand that this is just about representation. Right? And I say just because we don't have a functioning democracy if we don't have equal representation. Right. Lastly, not lastly, but I'm trying to speed up. It's really not a rural urban issue either. And that's because most rural as well as suburban districts do not have a prison in them. Right. And that was particularly meaningful for folks to think about who live in rural areas, that their neighbor who lives down the road falls into the district that has a prison. Their neighbor has more political power than them, right? And that's the majority of, you know, I started out saying that today. The majority of us are disadvantaged by this policy if you do not live near a prison, right? And certainly, yeah, so it's really not one of those urban rural divides where it makes some type of clean cut. And that's because also we've become so suburbanized where populations are really spread out. One other thing to note that I think is important, and this is something we're including in our current analyses as we go through each state. So I'll have more to come on this, but at least in Pennsylvania in our previous analysis, this did not divide along partisan lines. Those 8 districts that would be unconstitutional if we had ended prison gerrymandering earlier in Pennsylvania, it was equally split, affecting, that's large part suburbanization, large part the fact that most legislators do not represent a district that has a prison in it, right? So again, there's a lot of fear mongering and like unknown about like what this would mean. And legislators are used to every single time we redistrict, right? Their boundaries change a little bit. They know that. Right? They're very used to it. And that's, you know, fundamentally what we're talking about here. We're not talking about some type of like extraordinary landscape shift, despite what some folks might get nervous about, right? So the last thing I think that Kate mentioned that would be useful to talk about is whether the federal census is, if they just change this tomorrow, then none of us would have to do any of this work, right? And unfortunately, and sure, if anyone has any inside knowledge, please shout, but nothing that I've heard of so far suggests that it's going to move soon. And that's in part because for the 2020 census, right? A couple of years ago, they did a public call for comments on what should we do about where incarcerated people are counted. And 78,000 public comments were made. And almost 100% of them were in favor of changing how we count incarcerated people. Only a handful were largely legislators who represent districts, and I'm talking literal handful, right, to be 0.01%, were against the change. So the public has spoken, and the census has not. If that didn't convince them, I'm not, you know, that's, you know, I don't think they're going to do it anytime soon. It's just administrative policy. They're not, it's about resources, right? More time, more money to go into prisons and collect the addresses. And just to be clear how much it's like not a controversial thing for the census to do, they're happy to do it for a fee, right? For states who want to pay the census collectors to go do it. Right? So it's not something that is logistical or problematic in any other respect than there has to be political will, right, to do it. And it doesn't seem to me from my experience that that is existing right now to change by the 2030 census, which brings me to why it is so important, right? Because it takes so long to get so many cats herded together that if your community is interested in changing this, that you start the sooner you can start, the better, right? To get everybody, because we're talking about multi-agency collaborations in many cases. And yes, I'm happy to talk more at length about logistics for what that means, but ultimately we're just want that home address, just like everyone else fills out on the search on the census. And then another question that I get a lot is, well, what about, so you saw that I focused on states today, and that's in part because of you know, what types of facilities people are in and data availability, but it's also that the district size, right? The average district size matters a lot. And so really, I think I have it, no? Okay, I might have lost the slide somewhere, but congressional districts in terms of, and maybe that's a little bit why the census is not as concerned with, is that there's not a lot of momentum in Washington. There have been bills introduced, but they're just sort of stagnant. Is that congressional districts are like at least 500,000 people. And so you would have to have a lot of prisons and a lot of, like, in order to push it over that threshold of plus or minus 5%, right? So really only in rare cases, and we're working on it, but there's not a lot of, that's likely where it doesn't matter as much. That doesn't mean that it's not a problem in terms of equal representation, but in terms of, you know, whether there's legal size requirement violations. And then what about local is something also, and that's that, so what happens, and Philadelphia just excitingly decided to, they already voted in their maps, but now they're going to fix it retroactively, supposedly. They're going to use the states adjusted because so many people are from Philly, right? But who are incarcerated, but they're also reallocating people who are in jails, right? But I say this, so when you think about, you know, Philadelphia, that's a majority minority city, very high incarceration rate, you know, when we think about where the impact is, the largest impact is by and large at the state level, most likely. And that's because in Philadelphia, so we have, so District 150 that I showed you at the very beginning, that's in Philadelphia County. And that district that has, oh no, not that one. Well, Philadelphia's jails within our city limits, right? Of course it is. But the person who's representing that district on city council, they have 4,000 extra constituents in there, right? Who aren't real, who are what we call phantom constituents. And so if you live in that district, you're way more likely to get your concerns heard, right? When we diffuse those 4,000 some people even into predominantly, you know, the heart of African-American neighborhoods in Philly, it's not enough to make many more districts like in violation, right? So if we're thinking about the local level, the impact is likely the most at the district that has a prison or facility in it, right? And ideally, we would love to reallocate everyone, right? Local, state, and federal. But reallocating some, like, I don't think we should let the, perfect be the enemy of the good. If progress is progress. And so, starting with state, I think is a great strategy to use. Again, please keep checking back or subscribe to RDHs to know about updates. And as our reports are released, as our data is released, and please spread the word with your networks. Really trying to get this into the hands of folks who can use it on the ground, because we're researchers and are happy to talk all day about technical things, but it really is the power of voices and people who have been thinking about these things for a long time that I think is the most meaningful. So Rory's session, Tuesday, 1 o'clock. Please feel free to reach out with questions. My email's there, or just Google me. But it's been a pleasure talking with you today. So please fire away questions. I know, I'm sorry I've gone over, but if you can stay for a few minutes, Kate, what do you think?
Yeah, definitely. I think I was able to handle a lot of the questions in the chat. If you do have a few minutes and a question still, please feel free to stay on. Yeah, so please speak up if I did not address your question or you'd like to ask again or another one. Definitely a lot of excitement and thanks in the chat to you. We received some questions just about the sort of how federal prisons were dealt with.
Yep, I should say as a add-on, the states that have requested and multiple times that the Federal Bureau of Prisons supply the addresses for those folks, because one solution is so you can either currently right now keep people in the districts who in some states don't have any federal prisons. It's really concentrated geographically in some cases, but of course also very political, who got those resources. But by and large, people who are in state facilities are not from the state, right? They're it's whoever has an open bed when someone is sentenced that meets the security requirements for that person, right? So they're really not local in any respect to the state. And so, whether you keep counting them right now as members of that district, or if you remove them, but then people don't have representation. Anyway, the Bureau of Prisons federally has refused multiple times, saying that it is a privacy violation. They will not provide the addresses to states who are like, we're trying to we're trying to equalize these things, right? These folks are missing from other states. And there's actually been a lot of interest among states saying, like, I was talking to Nevada recently, and folks there were like, well, all these people come to, from out of state to Las Vegas, and then they end up in our system. Like, we need to return these people, right? But federally, there does not seem to be the support to do that, even though there seems to be increasing interest in getting it right? Only counting people where they're from. Yeah.
Thank you for that. I also see that Amanda Peterson has her hand up. Amanda?
Yeah, hi. So I'm an organizer with the Wisconsin Fair Maps Coalition. So we work on gerrymandering, but a lot of our volunteers wanted more information about prison gerrymandering, because we know that's an issue too. So I guess I'm curious about how much, if we're going to push for legislation to end regular, partisan gerrymandering and prison gerrymandering, how specific do we need to be in the wording of what we're asking for? Like in California, did they spell out in their laws all of those things? Like you have to do the home address. Like, should we be looking at doing that right now? That's what I'm asking.
Please shoot me a note, in part because Wisconsin is a state we struggled with because we don't, unfortunately, it's really come down to on the ground contacts. And so we ran models early on because we actually got addresses. Wisconsin dumped them all. And so we were really excited. And unfortunately, there's some really serious issues with your, I'm sure you know, with your map. So please, I'd love to connect with you. But I would use those, I would start with, and again, send me a note. There's a couple of great, so NCSL has like a summary chart of here's the states, here's the differences. PPI has one too, but I'm happy to talk through, but I would start with like what the legislation wording is of other states, and you'll be surprised that some of them are just like, yep, we're gonna fix it, right? And unfortunately, like we need, if we're gonna do it, if we're gonna do it right. And please send me a note. Yeah.
I will. Thanks.
Thanks, Amanda. And Andrea asked in the chat about a data file available to the public of all the districts that have a prison. And so I linked to PPI. They do have a national file with the prison locations in there. And then at RDH, we have individual state specific shape files if you're just looking for an individual state.
Yep.
Any other questions? I see folks still hanging around, which I really appreciate you all.
Yeah, I'm so sorry. Yeah, I talked way too much.
No, it's an important, it is a complicated issue, you know, once you start digging into it. And so
yeah,
really appreciate you cracking open the box a little bit for us. Well, as I've said before, if you do have a question that occurs to you later, I hope you know where to find us, info or help at redistrictingdatahub.org. If it's a question that is better answered by Dr. Remster, I can certainly pass it along, or she shared her contact info as well. And again, a reminder that the second training will be held 1 p.m. Eastern time next Tuesday, March 15th. We hope to see all of you there. And thanks again for attending. Hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you for the work that you do.